Hello and welcome to Sterne Look. I'm your host, Peter Sterne. Today we'll be taking a stern look at immigration reporting with three fantastic guests. First, we'll hear from Max Rivlin Nadler, a reporter at KPBS in San Diego. Then we'll hear from independent journalist Jack Herrera in San Francisco, California. And finally, we'll hear from Rebecca Entralgo, who is a former reporter at NPR who now works as a media advocacy specialist. We'll start with you, Max. So, first of all, can you tell me a little about your background as a journalist? How long have you been at KPBS, and how long have you been doing immigration reporting?
I've been at KPBS now for almost 2 years, but I've been doing immigration reporting since before I moved to San Diego so I've been a reporter for around 10 years. And before I moved to San Diego, I was covering the criminal justice system, transit. I was writing for places like Gothamist, The Village Voice, Gawker for a little bit. And at those places, something I kept finding through my reporting on criminal justice was this overlap between the criminal justice system and the immigration system. So really, my entryway into immigration reporting was through, what's termed as crimmigration, was people being deported based off of, sometimes serious offenses, often low-level offenses, crimes involving moral turpitude, and then shortly after the Trump administration, I moved to San Diego to cover the border, which was an entirely different perspective on covering immigration issues.
So I think that's an interesting point, that when you moved to San Diego to cover the border, that is a different beat almost than what you were doing when you were in New York, even though you were covering immigration and like immigration detention. Can you speak a little for viewers who might not know that much about the U.S. immigration system and the immigration detention system? What is it like covering immigration in a city that is far away from the border? Why are people detained other than when they first cross?
Right. So in New York, you had a lot of instances where people were being arrested at courthouses, where basically people who were showing up for court cases involving really low-level offenses somehow ended up on, not somehow, we know how they ended up on ICE's radar, which is that they have access to these databases that show when people are showing up for court. ICE was stalking them at courthouses. And also for a very long time through the Obama administration, the Department of Corrections in New York City was itself turning people over. So you had a lot of overlap. We look at the Obama administration as if it's so long ago, but we have this huge overlap between federal immigration enforcement and local policing, which doesn't really begin to get kind of clamped down on outside of the advocacy of several groups who raised alarm bells over what the Obama administration was doing, in fact, increasing deportations, especially as compared to the end of the Bush era and the beginning of his first term. And they were increasing those deportations based on people who had criminal records and getting them through the intersection with the criminal justice system. So that's what you see oftentimes in New York, which was a huge feeder into ICE detention. Along the border, the way that people most often end up in detention is through 1325, which is a federal statute, which is illegal entry, or 1326, another federal statute, which is illegal re-entry. So these are people who cross the border, and for a very long time, the vast majority of them were just being sent back to Mexico, being removed. But under this zero tolerance paradigm that this enforcement priority that Jeff Sessions instituted, they were being jailed and they were being prosecuted and they were being given serious prison time for either showing up just for the first time crossing the border or for repeatedly crossing the border. So it was a different way that you ended up in the system, the larger system, and especially for people who ended up here at the border, you were most likely going to a private detention facility, where we've seen reports of and I've seen with my own eyes, some truly horrendous conditions, especially during the coronavirus pandemic.
Okay, so I want to unpack some of that a bit. and talk about, I guess, the different ways that people who immigrate to this country, to the United States, end up in jails and prisons. So it sounds like what you're saying is that before the Trump administration, you would have people who would cross the border, and if they got caught while they were crossing the border without documents, they were undocumented immigrants, then they would generally be deported away from the border in places like New York and in other cities that are far away from a national border. People would generally come into the immigration system when they were accused of or arrested for other crimes. Like they would be detained by police and then they'd be handed over to ICE.
Right. There's a lot of different ways to enter the immigration system and the criminal justice system. Here along the border, you have this thing, expedited removal. So people can, by law and by the regulation that DHS has handed down, be removed fairly quickly, especially if they're from Mexico. That's a fairly quick process in a lot of cases. In New York, what you are also seeing, and inside the interior of the country, what you're seeing is people who have legal status, like through a green card, that they're losing that green card because of this thing I mentioned before, these low-level offenses, crimes involving moral turpitude, which is basically in the regulations that say if you have two of these crimes that are nonviolent, that somehow involve your own moral upstanding, and in New York especially, the trigger for that oftentimes was jumping a turnstile. If you get two of those, you will lose your green card and be removed or be eligible to be removed by ICE. And that's something that I saw reporting in New York was this huge overlap and basically this dissonance between the de Blasio administration, which wanted to put forward that it was extremely accepting to immigrants, but at the same time, it was promoting this style of policing popularized by then Police Commissioner Bill Bratton, which was to crack down on quality of life offenses. And so that was putting immigrants directly into ICE's dragnet at exactly the wrong time. And the mayor completely didn't understand that that's how people end up in the immigration system, to the point of, I would ask him at a press conference and he says, no one's being deported over a turnstile jump. And, because I was writing for the Village Voice at the time, I very much got to say, you're wrong, you're lying about that. Because you have a little bit more freedom at alternative magazines to really challenge people. And, to this day, they still haven't backed away from that policy. People are still being arrested for turnstile jumps.
And I would hope that, the mayor would know that and would understand the consequences of his criminal justice policy. But I do think that, his belief is shared by a lot of people. And that's why, I'm sort of hopping on this point that a lot of people who end up in the immigration detention system and who end up getting deported are not necessarily people who were unable to enter the United States. Like they were caught at the border and turned away, or caught at the border and then detained. Like these are people who, for all intents and purposes, are Americans and have been living in the United States and get deported when they are accused of a crime other than just being in the country without documents.
Right, and a large amount of people who end up, normalizing their status and gaining status in the country end up doing that through overstaying things like a tourist visa or a student visa. A lot of people are able to, find a new home that way. What we're I haven't mentioned yet that is a general element here along the border is the asylum cases. So even when you cross the border outside of a port of entry, you are then able to apply for asylum because you step foot in the U.S. And for the vast majority of cases that people are basically fighting and staying in these ICE facilities, it's because they have a pending asylum claim. A lot of people are coming for work, but a lot of people, especially from Central America, from Haiti, from Cameroon, I've been reporting on, are coming to claim asylum. And that's why they're entering outside of a port of entry, which is the formal way that people are allowed to enter, because they, for the most part, have been closed to asylum seekers since even before the pandemic.
And how has the asylum policy or process in the United States changed over the last few years? Because I know that the Trump administration certainly made it harder to gain asylum. How specifically did they do that? And is there any way for people to obtain asylum now, or have Trump and the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security basically shut the door on that in contravention of international law?
They've tried their best to end asylum. There's still going to be ways that people get some sort of status through, CATS, if CAT, which is Convention Against Torture, if they're fearful of torture, that's not in and of itself status. But they tried a lot of different ways to get around basically our existing asylum obligations and our laws. This has included things like the third country ban, where if you're entering the United States, and you traveled through South America and Central America, like many people have, and you didn't apply for asylum at any of those countries first, they're saying you have to go back and try to apply for asylum in those countries. There's agreements that they've created with countries like El Salvador that say, we will send people not from El Salvador to El Salvador to apply for asylum there instead of the US. And this week, just this week, you have these new regulations coming into effect that will really clamp down on asylum. So there are still ways to get asylum in the United States. They weren't able to take it all down, but they put a lot of impediments in the way. And I think one thing that people are going to have to get their head around is that the Biden administration will not be able to flip a switch here. It's going to be very difficult. And I think in some cases, they might not want to flip that switch, given their political inclinations. There are things that the Trump administration did, which frankly, people in the Biden administration probably agree with.
Well, I think that's an important point, because a lot of the sort of deportation ramp up started under the Obama administration. And this whole edifice of a sort of criminalized immigration policy where people are detained and deported from the country seemed to start under Clinton. So it seems like this is a bipartisan project. Like, can you talk about what the system was like before the 90s?
Before the comprehensive immigration reform, it was very different. And I think I'm not really qualified to speak. I haven't done a ton of research about what it looked like pre-1994. But if you're wondering when America takes turns on several instances, it's always good to bet 1994, because that's where a lot of these laws come into effect. And then once you have DHS in late 2001, things change again. So the immigration enforcement, the federal immigration enforcement infrastructure has changed tremendously in just the past 25 years. But that's not being said that people before this were not jailed for illegal entry, were not put into detention. This always happened. Deportations always happened in the United States for over a century. The law has always been extremely racialized, and this is just a heightening of enforcement, and coupled with the rise of the private prison industrial complex that allows people to make money off of these things. So that's how you saw a real rise in the amount of people in detention. People were making money.
Max, I know you have to get going soon, so I'll just ask you one last question, which is, what would you want journalists who don't cover this beat to know about immigration reporting? What is something they should keep in mind? And then what is something that normal people, non-journalists, should know about, the way that immigration and the immigration detention system work in the United States that is not necessarily well known?
I think if, basically talking to people, if you want to become an immigration reporter, there are so many overlapping systems here at play that really unwinding them takes a good amount of work. And, I'm on year like 5 of this beat, and I'm still unwinding them. And I see other people who are going to be speaking later who know this stuff. And I'm really excited to hear from them. So I would just say, you need to understand that this didn't arise out of nowhere and didn't come kind of with this wave of nationalism under Trump. It's been building for years and years and is part of a larger project that's been happening in local law enforcement and our federal immigration enforcement and our policy towards places like Haiti, Central America, et cetera. And then
I think we lost Max, unfortunately, in the middle of his final answer. I hope he comes back so he can finish his thought. But in the meantime, we will go to Jack Avera, an independent immigration reporter in San Francisco. Jack has been leaving a lot of comments in the HAPS comment thread, commenting on things that Max has said. So now I will actually bring him on and give him the chance to talk more about that. So, Jack, you say here that the first instance we see mass incarceration of immigrants was likely during the Haitian refugee crisis in the early 90s. Can you talk more about that? I think you're muted. All right, sorry for the technical difficulties, everyone. Yeah, I cannot hear you now. Okay, Jack. All right, Jack, are you talking now?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you. So if you can expand on your point about the Haitian refugee crisis.
Yeah, so I think if you were to go back and through the course of the entire 20th century, there was detention or deportation of immigrants. I mean, if you look at Ellis Island or Angel Island on the West Coast, a large part of those facilities were made for typically short-term detention, especially for people who were expected to have something like tuberculosis or other communicable diseases. The first instance, though, that you see mass detention of immigrants was during the Haitian refugee crisis. During the dictatorship in the early 1990s, tens of thousands of Haitians fled political violence in Haiti. They were intercepted by the U.S. Navy and brought to a military base, then little known, called Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. And this was what you see was the first instance of tens of thousands of immigrants, including families, including children, being imprisoned by the U.S. government. It was a massive refugee camp that included Haitians and later Cuban refugees in Cuba in the Guantanamo base. And in, I think, 1994, a U.S. federal judge referred to it as a prison camp. The conditions were fetid and terrible, and really has a legacy now in the ICE detention camps, the archipelago of family detention centers that exist domestically now. It was the first instance where the United States was committed to incarcerating tens of thousands of families.
So it really is the, I guess, late 80s and early 90s where you see the beginning of this mass incarceration of immigrants, including people who, well, I guess originally with the Haitian refugee crisis, this was people who were fleeing Haiti and trying to come to the United States. And then you saw the growth of this immigration detention system that also began going after people who had been in the country for many years when they intersected with the criminal justice system.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you don't start seeing the mass buildup of detention centers until the 90s. And then especially with the restructuring of the federal government, we see the creation of the Department of Homeland Security in 2003. And with that comes ICE, which replaced the INS. And with that, you see certainly a militarization of immigration detention and immigration enforcement. At that point in time, largely with the justification of terrorism, that there was a fear and continues to be a fear, I think fair to say completely unfounded, that terrorists or people committing acts of terror are crossing the southern border. Or that they're already in the country and need to be sought out by immigration authorities. And that was the justification for a large buildup of the militant aspects of ICE and other immigration enforcement agencies.
So it seems like you had this rationale that was originally focused on, rooting out terrorists, that then sort of gradually got transferred from terrorists to criminals. The idea that Obama had was, we're going to go after people, not innocent people. We're going to go after people with criminal records because those are bad people and we don't want them in the country. So there's sort of that slow creep from, we don't want, people who are going to do the next 9/11 to sneak through the border, and we're going to go after them in sort of this militarized fashion. And then it became, we're going to go after anyone who's committed a crime, which ends up ensnaring people like Max, and I think you were talking about, people who jump turnstiles, people who even have low-level offenses. They get marked as targets. And then from there, you sort of see the apotheosis with Trump, where he's going after anyone who he considers an immigrant, even people who are here in the country legally. It just becomes so racialized.
Sure. I mean, I think that one of the most important things to understand, and what is misunderstood when we talk about criminals or people with criminal records in ICE detention, ICE is very, very rarely arresting people who are fugitives from the law. When we talk about people who have criminal charges who are in ICE detention, almost always they've already served their prison sentence or otherwise haven't had to do any time because the judge, they weren't assigned that when they were convicted. And I think that's one of the things that's really misunderstood and what immigration advocates will call the double punishment of being an immigrant in this country, which is that if you commit a crime in this country, in the criminal justice system, the criminal justice system deals with you. You go to prison, you go to jail, or you're otherwise dealt with within that system. It's after you're released, often the day you're released from prison, that ICE will then come and enter you in deportation proceedings, and that's when you'll spend time in immigration detention. And this year, for instance, I've spoken with, close to a dozen different people in ICE detention, and many of them are in that position where they'd finished a prison sentence, often for nonviolent crimes, and now found themselves in ICE detention. And basically they had been looking forward to reuniting with their families, and the day that they came for them to be released, they found themselves in ICE detention. And I do think it's important to remember that, I think that regardless of the level of offense, these are all people that the criminal justice system, as merciless and as brutal as mass incarceration is in this country, everyone in that system ends up in ICE detention. A judge has agreed that they've either already served their sentence or is not a danger to the community and is set to be released. And so when ICE says that we're keeping people in ICE detention because they're dangerous, that doesn't really stand in the logic of the criminal justice system, because you don't get to ICE detention until you're done serving your prison sentence, until you've been deemed eligible to reenter society. And of course, there's the problem, the logic of incarceration, that's working within the logic of incarceration. I think there's a good argument that, all the reasons why advocates say people shouldn't be locked in ICE detention applies to people in criminal justice setting as well. And I think that it's important for us to be critical of both carceral settings.
But I think you make a good point, though. By even their own logic, it seems like ICE or immigration detention in some ways could be considered an extra legal system of detention, where it's in addition to and outside of the criminal justice system. It reminds me of the way that, speaking of Guantanamo, the way that the U.S. treated, accused terrorists captured overseas. Instead of bringing them to the U.S. to face trial in a criminal justice proceeding, they just did these military tribunals and held them without charges indefinitely at Guantanamo Bay. And you see something similar with the growth of immigration detention, where if these people are accused of crimes, they are either serving their sentence already or they're just being deported. This ICE detention exists outside of the criminal justice system, and that also means that people who would be defendants or suspects are not entitled to the same rights as Americans would get in the criminal justice system, right? what is the difference between an immigration proceeding and like a criminal trial? Because it seems like immigration judges are, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that criminal trial judges are sympathetic or lenient, but it seems like immigration judges are not even trying to be fair.
Yeah, I think that it's difficult to make a broad generalization about immigrant judges. They come from a variety of different backgrounds. Some are former ICE prosecutors. Some of them are former advocates, or people who are defending asylum seekers. So it is a broad change, and I think that that's part of what advocates point to as a problem with the system, is that there is a certain amount of unfairness, because depending on which judge you get in front of, you have a different level of success on your case. But I think in general, the most systemic issue to understand the system of immigration detention or immigration enforcement versus the criminal justice system, is that the immigration court is not an independent judiciary. It's not part of the judiciary branch. It's actually part of the Department of Justice, which means that instead of the Supreme Court setting precedent, it's actually the Attorney General themselves who gets to make a lot of these determinations on what is the legal doctrine that is going to be followed when it comes to immigration detention, which makes, for the last few years, William Barr was essentially a one-person Supreme Court when it came to deciding the application of the law in these immigration settings. That also means that the judges in the immigration system have limited independence because they're not part of an independent judiciary. And then the system itself, when it comes to people who are in a dependent position, unlike in the criminal justice system, people in the immigration system do not have the right to lawyers. They can, if you can afford one, or if a pro bono lawyer will work with you, you can have some legal representation, but you are not guaranteed a lawyer the same way you are in a criminal justice system.
So that means that, and I assume that when immigrants in the immigration detention system or in the immigration court system don't have attorneys, then they generally lose their cases.
Yeah, I think there are studies that show that if you have a lawyer in the immigration system, you're something like 5 times more likely to win your case, which means that it's a dramatic issue. It makes it much harder for you to win your case if you don't have representation. I think that 5 times refers to people in asylum cases, but obviously that's, for many people, life and death matter. So having a lawyer makes an enormous amount of difference. And I think anybody can tell you that when you're going to court, you want a lawyer. And I think that the stakes in immigration proceeding are often not less serious, and indeed can be even more serious than a criminal justice proceeding. And so the idea that a person doesn't need a lawyer, I think is laughable. It's a very immigration law. I've been reporting on this for years, and I would certainly need a lawyer if I was going to, be in immigration proceedings. It's an immensely complex and often arcane legal system that people are having to deal with.
And again, this is a relatively new legal system. Like, there's always been immigration law, but the idea of, tens or hundreds of thousands of people going through this process and being detained indefinitely or deported as a result of these arcane immigration statutes and their interpretation by judges who are following the guidelines of the Department of Justice, that is a relatively new development, right? Within the last 25 years.
Yeah, I think there have been, large scale changes. I think that certainly, like with the restructuring of the Department of Justice in the wake of 9/11, not the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security in the wake of 9/11, you do see in a massive buildup of Border Patrol and of ICE, where to the point now, Customs and Border Protection, CBP, has the largest manpower of any federal law enforcement agency. It's has thousands more agents than the FBI even.
And now I want to go to a question that Apprehensive Fly asked that we've presented a few times on screen, so I'll just do it again, which is, do you think the mass buildup from the 90s is what caused the enforcement in the early 2000s?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I appreciate that being asked. I think that as a reporter, I'd always stress that there isn't, when it comes to immigration, as a sociological issue, immigration itself, and then as enforcement, it's really hard to point at any single one cause at any time. So I try and resist, saying that this is due to one thing or another. It's never monocausal. In the early 2000s, for instance, there was a unprecedented number of Mexican immigrants crossing the border because of a decaying and an economy in seriously bad condition in Mexico. And so during the early years of the Bush administration, there was, in fact, a large number of people crossing the border, and that led to create political pressure for a strong enforcement mechanism. As I think hopefully a lot of people know, that immigration from Mexico is more or less completely dropped off in the last 10 years, to the point that in 2014, for the first time, there was what was called reverse flow, which is that more Mexicans were leaving the United States and going back to Mexico than were coming in. Now it's been, the last few years have seen, with some exceptions, historically low levels of immigration across the southern border, and persistently very low levels of Mexicans. It's mostly crossing the border now. It's mostly Central Americans, and most of them, or at least a good portion of them, are asylum seekers.
So it's not just, I think that there's a general feeling that, especially with Mexican immigration, you had people crossing the border for primarily economic reasons. But now, as opposed to crossing and then requesting asylum.
Yeah, I think that that's always a dichotomy that I try and resist, this difference between an asylum seeker and economic migrant. To illustrate that point, let's go back to the origin of the term economic migrant, but not one you use, but one that a lot of people will recognize and understand conceptually when thinking through these issues. That term really comes to prominence when people fleeing civil wars in Guatemala and El Salvador during the 20th century, late 20th century, 70s, 80s, and 90s, arrived on the border. And Ronald Reagan, who supported the far-right governments in El Salvador and Guatemala, was at an impasse because during the Carter administration, the United States had finally signed on to its refugee obligations. It had to accept people fleeing persecution, and genocide of indigenous people, certainly persecution. And so he had an obligation to accept refugees. He also was supporting the far right-wing governments who were deploying death squads in Guatemala and El Salvador. And so to thread the needle to solve both these problems, Reagan deployed the phrase, and his team deployed the phrase economic migrant. And he said that these Central Americans, again, what was happening in Central America has been legally recognized as genocide on multiple occasions in multiple international courts. He referred to these people who were fleeing that genocide as economic migrants. And that solved two problems. It helped him cover up the massacres in Central America being perpetuated by U.S. government-aligned forces. And it also helped him resist the legal obligation to accept refugees. And I think today that's an important history to remember when we're talking about the dichotomy, or talking about, like, is this person an asylum seeker? Are they fleeing violence? Are they fleeing for economic reasons? As a reporter who's reported in northern Mexico and through Mexico, traveled with people traveling from Central America up through Mexico, I can say that people will answer the questions you ask them. If you ask them, are you fleeing for economic reasons? They'll say, yes, certainly. And they'll talk about the economic hardship that they faced at home. And then if you ask, are you fleeing because of persecution or violence? They'll say, well, you know what some of my economic problems is that the gangs, the maras, will charge me a tax on my shop. And they'll take 40% of my income each month. Basically what they call is for protection, but it's an extortion. And so you see these instances, these conditions of violence or economic desperation are inherently intertwined, and it's very difficult to separate them out. And so that's why I try and resist defining a single reason why anyone leaves their home country. And certainly people who are leaving Mexico in the 2000s and people who are leaving Central America today knew what awaited them in the United States, which is massive enforcement, the possibility of long-term detention or deportation, and also economic and social hardship once in this country. It's a very difficult decision to leave one's own country. And for whatever reasons, these people had a very good reason to leave their home
and I think that is such an important point to make, that the people who migrate to the United States over the past, let's say, 20 years, were aware that the United States was not like a paradise. It was not so much that there were pull factors bringing them to the U.S. as there were push factors pushing them out of their home countries. And I think that's important, because there is sometimes this stereotype that people want to come to the United States because they think that, it is the greatest country in the world. And so they just want to come here to enjoy that, and, perhaps to use our very generous social safety net. Like this idea of, that Trump has promoted, this idea of the public charge, that we should not allow migrants who are going to be a drain on the system, as if people would come to the United States because our welfare policies were so generous. But I do think that's an important thing to sort of grapple with, because I think it is a common way that people see the issue. And I do want to highlight this this comment from Big Z 1981, because again, I think this is a common response you get when you talk about the immigration process, which is, they say, I don't blame people for wanting to come here, and I welcome hardworking people to our country, but why shouldn't immigration judges follow the letter of the law? Most countries are very strict with their immigration policies. And this is something that I think people who advocate for restrictive immigration policies often point to, this idea that other countries are very strict with their immigration policies. Doesn't the US have a right to be strict and to control who can come into the country? And again, there's this idea that like people want to come to the US, but not everyone in the world can be lucky enough to be an American. So what sort of is your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I mean, I think that, as Rebecca said in the comments, immigration law is broken. And I think that you will see people on both sides of the aisle, from the most stringent anti-immigration advocates on the right, all the way to people advocates on the left who are in support of open borders, will say that the immigration legal system as we have is arcane and asinine and obsolete and filled with contradictions. And that makes a judge's job very difficult, because when it comes to following the letter of the law, that's going to be very difficult to parse out. These laws are not well written, and they were meant as compromises to be amended, but we've now gone decades and decades without any sort of comprehensive immigration reform. And so I think that that's one reason to start off right now, is that you're throwing judges into an impossible situation when you ask them to follow the letter of the law, because the law is not clear. And beyond that, as a perspective of a journalist, I think that there is an immigration legal system. There are laws that exist, and I try and be clear about what those laws are and when they've been violated. But I do think that this country has such a long and intense legacy of anti-immigration hysteria, from dating back to the Chinese Exclusion Act, for instance, where immigrants have been blamed for social problems that more properly have their origin in government mismanagement and large-scale social and economic inequality. For instance, the robber barons in California were more to blame for the hardship of working-class people in California in the late 1800s than Chinese immigrants were. Chinese immigrants get blamed and they get banned. And that's a mindset in my reporting that I try and be aware and critical of, which is this mindset that it's a zero sum, that when immigrants come to this country, that's a negative effect for people already here. I can point to a wealth of studies that show that increased immigration rises tides, is a rising tide that rises all boats. It's not a negative for people already here. And this idea, I think one of the fundamental myths that I want to correct when I write about immigration is this idea that people remain undocumented immigrants or come to this country as undocumented immigrants because they're trying to avoid paying taxes. I think that both research and anecdotal experience will both point out that is entirely untrue, that people are not trying to take advantage of the tax system by being undocumented immigrants. Rather, they're dealing with a remarkably restrictive immigration system. And then finally, to that point, this idea of how other countries deal with the immigration system. Europe has the Schengen Agreement, where people from, basically 24 other countries can cross the borders and find work in other countries with zero restrictions. And Europe has not broken down because of that. Likewise, in the 20th century, up until around the 1960s, the U.S. had what could fairly be called open borders for Europeans. You did not have to have a visa when you showed up from Italy or from Ireland or from Germany at Ellis Island. You just had to show up, and if you weren't deemed to have tuberculosis or there were immigration restrictions that existed at that time, but in general, as a rubber stamp, you might have your name changed. I have an Italian ancestor whose name was changed from Macaroni to Marconi at Ellis Island, and so you might face that. But in general, it was you're welcome. Like come to the United States, and we accepted thousands and thousands of people, such a significant percentage of the United States population at the time, that to accept the number of immigrants the United States accepted during the 20th century would be akin to accepting tens of millions of immigrants today. And that immigration did not destroy the United States. It did not lead to, widespread societal breakdown. And so I think this idea that a more liberal immigration system would be negative for the United States, it's such a big question and not one I pretend to know the answer to, but it's one I take critically. I don't think that immigration is necessary. There's not much evidence that it's a negative for a country, that massive immigration is a problem, or at least not a problem that can't be dealt with.
Yeah, I feel like there's also this assumption that if the U.S. were to have a more or less open border policy where people could just generally come to the country and stay in the country and work and pay taxes, and not have to go through a Kafkaesque, labyrinthine immigration legal system, there's sort of this assumption that if we opened the borders, then everyone from around the world would try to come to the U.S. Everyone from Mexico would come into the U.S. And there wouldn't be enough room for everyone. But it doesn't necessarily seem that having open borders would lead to tens or hundreds of millions of people trying to come to the U.S.
Yeah, I think that I reported a year ago on a collection of studies that found that more liberal immigration policies don't suddenly lead to a deluge of people immigrating. That immigrating is a hard decision and it's a difficult thing to do, and not one that people do lightly or on the fly, unless it's a refugee situation, of course. And I think that the other conception that everyone immigrating is very low income. In general, immigrants around the world are middle class, upper middle class, and upper class. And that's simply because they're the people who have the means to immigrate. And I think that this idea that, I think there's two questions, two massive sociological questions in that assumption that I don't have the ability to answer, and I don't think anybody does, but I can say that they need to be thought of critically. The first one is, if we had open borders, would that lead to hundreds of thousands or millions of people suddenly immigrating? I don't think that there's evidence to say that would certainly happen. That needs to be thought of critically. And secondly, if that did happen, would that necessarily be a negative thing for the United States? We have an aging population. And when more people show up to the country, we don't have a static amount of jobs. When the population grows, there's more need for services, and so the need for jobs grows. And so I do think that if, you know, a million people showed up tomorrow in one day, that would simply be a policy, you know, a bureaucratic issue that would be hard to deal with. But if you had over the next 10 years, millions of people immigrate to the United States, I don't think that would necessarily, it has to be thought of critically, I don't think necessarily that would lead to any wide-scale problems, and indeed might lead to massive economic growth, as it did in the 20th century, when a significant part of the United States population came to this country, and the population grew by millions.
And I think your point about how you need to think of those questions critically and interrogate those assumptions goes to the heart of, you know, what it means to do good immigration reporting. You know, it's not just writing that Republicans and Democrats are trying to come to a compromise where Democrats want more immigrants because they are, you know, almost like out of a charity. They want to help people. And Republicans, you know, are the hard-nosed realists who say, no, we need to be more restrictive, and they're trying to come to a compromise. But, you know, to really do good journalism on this beat would mean understanding the experiences of people who are immigrants, and interrogating the assumptions that everyone wants to come to the U.S. and that this is a massive swell of people that the U.S. cannot deal with. Not just talking about like how do people feel about the immigration debate, but I think reframing the debate in some ways. And
yeah, I mean, I think that there's a similar paradigm here. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think there's a similar paradigm here. What's happened in the last decade with the Black Lives Matter movement to look at systemic anti-Blackness and racism, and look at the effect it's had on the criminal justice system or the residential system or the education system. And when you really start to look at the legacy of Jim Crow and slavery and redlining in this country, you see that these systems, which on the surface appear objective or rule of law based, continue to perpetuate and facilitate a white supremacist system in this country that, you know, today means that residential segregation is higher than it was in the last 60 years. Educational segregation is just worse than it was in the last 60 years. The economic comparisons between white and black community are some of the, you know, have not improved since Jim Crow ended. And so something about our systems is continuing to perpetuate those inequalities. And I think there's a similar paradigm that is worth investigating when it comes to immigration, which is remembering that our country has a deep-seated legacy. Again, go back to the Chinese Exclusion Act and other sorts of race-based exclusion acts that existed until the Civil Rights Act in 1964, that scapegoated and demonized and blamed immigrants for the social ills in this country. And that rhetoric for the social ill in this country now fits into a deeply American logic that immigrants in general are a bad thing, and accepting immigrants into this country is a sort of charity that is a negative thing for the United States but helps the people coming in. I don't think that we should accept that logic, or at least not accept it uncritically. I think that we need to really question whether or not our basic assumptions of how immigration works are true. And I think recognize that we have, I grew up in the United States, and for other people who grew up in the United States, recognize that we were raised in a country with a deep, centuries-old legacy of anti-immigrant bigotry at every level of our country. And I think that recognizing that, and recognizing that our logic might be skewed because of that fact, is vital towards not just immigration reporters, but anyone thinking about and dealing with these issues.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Jack. I think that's, some really important things to think about, especially for reporters, not just on the immigration beat, and also for, ordinary people who look at the coverage of, again, the quote unquote immigration debate, or are interested in these topics that, even framing this as a debate about what should the United States do, as though immigrants were, this foreign other, especially immigrants who have already lived in this country for years or decades and only end up in immigration detention due to the criminal justice system. Framing them as though there's some other, this swell of people on the southern border who are not American and want access to, our American identity and values and welfare system. That framing in and of itself can be problematic, not just because it's racist, but because it obscures the actual reality of, what this country has been, what immigration to this country was like before the 90s, for much of the 20th century, at least from Europe, and what might actually happen if the US were to have less restrictive immigration policies. So again, thank you so much for that, Jack. Now we will hear from... Okay, now we will hear from Rebecca. Rebecca, first of all, can you tell me... Okay, hold on. Okay, I'm going to say goodbye to Jack and hello to Rebecca. Rebecca, I think you're finally on the screen now. Again, to all the viewers, especially the ones on Reddit who are very critical of the mistakes that I make in trying to bring different people on, I apologize. I love using Haps. It is a great way to interview multiple people, but it is difficult to simultaneously host a show and also produce it. So again, I apologize. I hope it doesn't take away from the really great conversations that I have here on the show with people like Max and Jack and now Rebecca. So Rebecca, first of all, can you tell me what your background is? I know that you were a journalist and then you went to what's sometimes considered the dark side. You're in public relations, communications now, representing big immigration. So yeah, just tell me what your background is and how long you've been doing immigration journalism and advocacy.
Yeah, so I came into reporting actually through public radio. When I was in college, I was really interested in, I'm a little bit younger, so when I was in college, serial was a big deal. And at the time, I was really interested in public radio reporting, using podcasting as a medium to do storytelling. And yeah, I worked at various NPR member stations in Florida, where I'm from, and eventually sort of made it up to the mothership here in DC, where I was an intern and a news assistant for a while before transitioning to my first full-time reporting role in 2016 with Think Progress, the now defunct Think Progress, where I reported on labor and the economy and the tax bill. And then sort of after our amazingly intrepid immigration reporter Esther left Think Progress, that happened in early 2018, so right before the family separation crisis, and we found ourselves at Think Progress in a hiring freeze, but also really needing someone to cover immigration. And I had covered immigration a bit as a reporter at in NPR member stations where I was previously located in Miami, and I covered it a little bit at Think Progress, and so kind of really dove in feet first to the immigration beat. And really just enjoyed covering immigration, and I covered that for about almost 2 years. And I think a lot of people, maybe your viewers may know what happened with Think Progress, where, towards August, we kind of were basically being told to just be looking for work elsewhere because at any point, the newsroom was going to be folding. So I had remembered working with Freedom for Immigrants as a reporter before, and really admired the organization's dedication to abolition, and really was just sort of thinking about, my career and would it be that big of a change for me to go from being, to switch over to being on the opposite side of the email, right? To be sort of the person who's doing the pitching as opposed to the person writing the story. And I found the transition to be very seamless. I think a lot of skills that I learned as a journalist really transition well into my current role. And yeah, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that, but that's kind of sort of the basis of my work with Freedom for Immigrants, and I've been in the role for over a year now, and have really learned a lot about immigration journalism and been and it's been a great and useful experience for me for sure.
And so I'll just sort of summarize a little bit of what you talked about with the whole thing with CAP, and I definitely want to hear your perspective on that. But essentially, Think Progress was an editorially independent news site that was nonetheless institutionally part of the Center for American Progress, the well-known center-left think tank in DC. The president of CAP, Neera Tanden, was recently named by Biden to what role?
Office of Management and Budget.
Yes, that well-known White House perch that everyone should know the title of. So she was recently named to the Office of Management and Budget, but while she was president of CAP, CAP decided to dissolve Think Progress. And so that meant that reporters like you, who were at Think Progress, had to find other work. And you said that you had worked with this immigration advocacy organization, Freedom for Immigrants, before as a reporter while you were covering immigration issues. And so then you went and joined them in a sort of public relations or communications capacity?
Yeah, I mean, I really don't see a lot of the work that I do as PR. I really sort of see it more as really narrative change strategy. I think a lot of what my role entails is to really help, reporters really see the issue of immigration the way that it is and the way that we want them to see it through our theory of change. And luckily with reporters like Jack and with reporters like Max, I don't have to do much, helping because they have, been on the beat for so long and have such a great nuanced approach to immigration reporting. But, I think a lot of work that we do is really on messaging and framing and really, helping stories, working with reporters like Jack, with reporters like Max to, help them find new stories to cover, maybe thinking about a different approach to a story, a different angle to a story. That was my big fear coming into comms, is that I would be seen as a kind of, public PR person. But, I think a lot of the skills that I have in journalism really translate to what I sort of see as media advocacy in a lot of ways. Because I think as reporters, you just have an eye for a story, right? So for example, I was in a staff meeting and a coworker of mine, mentioned in passing that she had filed a civil rights complaint on behalf of some people who were detained at Adelanto, which is the largest, immigrant prison in California, had reported that the facility was using a very toxic chemical disinfectant spray during COVID-19. And they told us that the spray said on the label that it should only be used outside, not in enclosed spaces, but they were spraying this like everywhere. Wow. in Adelanto. And when she said that to me, I think, people who are working in the monitoring space and are, listening to these abuses that come in about immigration tension every day, you can sometimes get desensitized into it. And so desensitized to it and not really see that for the story that it is really. And so I remember her saying that and I was like, wait, like, why didn't you tell me this? Like, give me this, civil rights complaint. I can place this with the reporter. And so she gave me a copy of the complaint and I sent it to a reporter at KPCC in LA. She wrote up a very quick story about it. It was published. And then within a matter of days, there were multiple petitions, Change.org petitions that had over 1 million signatures, calling for, Governor Newsom to step in and take action about this. There are a couple of viral, Instagram posts that went around about this. I know on our organizational account, we had seen an increase of people following our account of almost of 100-200% increase of people who were just really enraged by this specific thing. And that wouldn't have happened if I wasn't sitting in on that staff meeting and was thinking like a reporter and being like, wait, that's a really interesting story. Let me find a reporter to cover this. And it got to the point where even reporters I know you had Hunter Walker at Yahoo News on your show had him on your show, he reached out to me and was like, this is a really important issue, and I'm, I have some bandwidth to cover it quickly. And so, even reporters like Hunter, who is, White House reporter, caught wind of this and reached out to cover it as well. So I think that's like, a very small example of how, a journalist, a former journalist, can sort of apply that sort of eye you have for stories, editorial eye, to sort of work in the advocacy space.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting point about how people who, are more in the muck with this kind of work may get desensitized or inured to it, whereas journalists are almost more optimistic in believing that they actually can make a difference by publicizing this. So it can be, very, very useful to have someone with a journalistic mindset in an advocacy organization like Freedom for Immigrants. And since you've talked so much about, reframing the way that journalists talk about immigration issues and the immigration debate, and I feel like that's something that, we've talked about on this show a lot, especially with Jack, this idea of interrogating, the assumptions that people make about the immigration debate and immigration policy in the U.S. So can you talk about the narrative changes that Freedom for Immigrants pushes for and that you believe journalists should make?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple. I think one definitely, Jack spoke to, and that's sort of like, the issue of immigration and the issue of, how to talk about immigrants who have past interactions with law enforcement, may have past criminal histories. And I think it's important for us, we as an organization, we've really started to think about making a conscientious change to, really center those voices in our work, because those voices are often the ones that get left out of the conversation. And we're seeing that, right now with COVID, a lot of the people who remain in detention, for one, detention levels are at an all-time low, right? There are about 15,000 people in immigration detention and ICE detention. That's way down from the record levels of like 50,000 plus that were previously in the Trump administration. And a lot of those people are people with, criminal histories who were paroled out of prison custody, either because they were susceptible to COVID-19, they, were older, or because they had a criminal record. And there's people who finished their sentences, have done their time in prison custody. And a lot of cases, ICE was waiting outside the prison, was waiting for them the next day to enter them into ICE custody. And so, a lot of those voices don't really get heard in the media, primarily because I get pitches like, hey, I'm a reporter. I want to talk to an asylum seeker who was a victim of sexual assault, who does not have a criminal record. And I get pitches like that pretty frequently, explicitly asking for asylum seekers without a criminal record. So, and I can't really understand the reason why. Like, I assume, coming from a place like Think Progress, I never really had that issue with an editor, asking them, like, you should only speak to someone who, doesn't have a criminal record. And I imagine it probably comes from the editor, or maybe it comes from the reporter themselves. But we really do see this.
I think as a former reporter, and someone who is so attuned to messaging, I assume, and I think you would probably agree, the reason why people ask for that is because they see people who don't have a criminal record as being more sympathetic subjects, which is, it can be a problematic, like, us versus them thing when you privilege a certain class of immigrants, such as people who don't have a criminal record, or, say, dreamers over all other immigrants. But that's clearly the impulse that is leading to that. But do you find that to be, is that counterproductive, or does it help when people sort of focus on the exemplary immigrants, because it makes people who would otherwise be, very anti-immigrant more accepting of immigrants' humanization?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I do think it is counterproductive and falls into that framing that was mentioned earlier, the families not felons framing, that just sort of, it ends up in the long run reinforcing the very thing that we're trying to address. And I think about all the people who get lost in that when we sort of narrow down who we think of as worth raising up their story. Like when I was a reporter, I interviewed a woman who, in Florida, undocumented immigrants, can't really get a driver's license. And there was a woman who was arrested. She was a mother arrested for driving without a license in Florida. And at the time, the police pulled her over, sort of gave her a warning. And when she went to go to the police station to go pay for the ticket in person, she was detained because the police, collaborate with ICE in that area. And she was, basically detained in police custody and then eventually transferred into ICE custody for wanting to go pay, a speeding ticket or something like that. And you really just sort of have to think about the ways in which the criminal justice system, the ways in which the immigration, detention system is already stacked up against immigrants, and sort of really have to factor that into the way. Really, I just have to take that into account when thinking about whose stories are worth raising. I think that everyone, their life is of value, regardless of how they got here. And I think that could be true I think that's true for in the immigration space in particular. And I think we're sort of seeing the immigration justice space is always kind of like a couple steps back from behind the criminal justice space. I think we're just kind of getting to a place in the criminal justice advocacy space where you have Donald Trump positioning himself as like a champion for criminal justice reform, and I think the immigration detention space is a couple steps behind that, and I think in the future we really need to work, those two movements really have to work together in lockstep, because it's the same system that's just detaining the same people, and I think that's something that I think under a Biden administration should be a priority. And unfortunately, I think we're kind of seeing the ways in which the Biden administration is like prioritizing ending, private prisons, but not really, talking about, okay, what about ICE contracts between, jails and prisons, like local county jails and prisons. I think there just needs to be a more holistic approach to the issue, and sort of realizing, and I think the previous speakers touched on it as well, just like the very various facets of overlapping space that are underneath the umbrella of immigration detention.
Is there a danger in tying immigration reform to criminal justice reform? Because people who might be sympathetic to immigrants, especially immigrants without a criminal record, would not necessarily be sympathetic towards incarcerated people.
Yeah, I think this is like a very emergent conversation that I think people in the immigration space and criminal justice space are happening. For example, like there at Freedom for Immigrants, we try and stay away from using the term immigration detention center, because we think it sort of whitewashes the experience of what ICE detention actually is. I think that's how you kind of get people on Fox News saying that, the children, I think it was like Laura Ingraham at one point, who was like, oh, those are it's like summer camp, like sending your kid to summer camp, right? And so we worked with directly impacted people who were released from ICE detention, who call our we have a free hotline for people on immigration detention, who call our hotline every day and tell us that what they experience is no different than a prison. And so we kind of made the narrative change strategy a couple of years ago to use the term like immigrant jail, ICE jail, immigrant prison. But that is in contrast to what I think some other people in the movement believe, that there isn't enough general understanding among the general population of the difference between an ICE detention center and a prison. And so if you say immigrant prison, you're just confusing the issue even more. And I do think that is
in some cases, though, immigrants are detained in actual jails.
Yes.
Like, you see that in around where I am in New York. Yeah. You have places in upstate New York, you have places in especially northern New Jersey, where these are county jails that right. ICE pays to basically rent out a wing. And it's like this wing ICE controls, and that's where they put immigration detainees. and the rest of it is where you have people detained by the criminal justice system.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
So in
definitely.
some cases, it literally is immigrant jails.
Yes, absolutely.
But I guess when you're talking about ICE detention centers, is that more like the ones on the border that are directly controlled by ICE, as opposed to jails that they rent out?
Like ICE detention centers can refer to also just like facilities that are operated by private prison companies on behalf of ICE, which is like the vast majority of people in ICE detention. I think it's over 70% at this point are detained at prisons that are owned by CoreCivic, owned by Geo Group, owned by these private prison companies that contract on behalf of ICE. And I definitely don't.
And are those exclusively immigration
Yes.
detention centers, or so it's not because like obviously these private prison companies also operate private prisons like for criminal justice, but they also have facilities that are specifically ICE detention.
Yes, yeah, definitely. For example, there's a facility outside DC and that is owned by a private prison company called ICA Farmville, or called ICA. The facility is called Farmville, and that is a facility that's it's operated by a private prison company, but it only detains people on behalf of ICE.
And so, certainly talking about private prison companies in connection with the expansion of sort of this mass incarceration of immigrants is one sort of political tactic. I know when we were talking about the ramp up in immigration enforcement in the late 90s and early 2000s, you mentioned the involvement of private prison companies. Mm-hmm. And I think it's something that, can be an effective rhetorical move because people instinctively feel that it is corrupt to have an immigration system that ends up caging lots of people and other people are making money off of it. But you also said that it's not enough for the Biden administration to only go after private prisons. So can you talk about what else needs to happen? Is it good to focus on private prisons, or does that distract from the main issue?
I think it's definitely, good to focus on private prisons and focus on the profit motive behind detaining thousands of people on behalf of the U.S. government. And I think, along with targeting private prisons, also comes with focusing on just like the utter lack of transparency, that goes on at detention facilities that are operated by private prison companies. Like, for example, and like I mentioned, like over 70% of people in ICE custody are detained at private prison companies. Those private prison companies are not obligated to report how many of their staff have tested positive for COVID because they're private prisons. They're a private company. So we have no idea, how many guards who come in and out of the facilities day and day have tested positive for COVID. Because they aren't required to report that information. I think that's, one of the reasons why it's important to focus on sort of ending private prisons, but also I think there just isn't the public education of, I don't think people know that their county jail in their neighborhood may detain, immigrants on behalf of ICE. Same thing with, I don't think people understand that people in that U.S. Marshal Services detains people on behalf of ICE as well. Like, this is an entire detention apparatus that is much larger than I think people think it is. And so I think that, focusing solely on private prisons isn't effective when it just has so many tendrils and is, so much more expansive than we think it is. And again, like, I think it's important to, go back to the point that the people who would get left out, well, focusing on that crimmigration angle as well, that there are people who are detained at county jails who may or may not have, previous interactions with law enforcement or criminal records. So, I definitely think that ending private prisons is a much needed step, but it's not the ultimate. It shouldn't be the end goal. I think we should be ending, police ending contracts between, jails and ICE for detaining people on behalf of ICE.
It seems like Sorry, I'll bring you back. It seems like there's a tension between how people think of immigrants as being like whether or not they are American. You know, they are by definition not American citizens, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not Americans. Like, are they Americans with a certain status, or are they outsiders who have come in, who are like physically located within the U.S.? And that goes back to, I think, this maybe excessive focus on border enforcement as opposed to detention of people who have been living in the United States.
Yeah, I think something that really opened my eyes up to that conversation recently is Freedom for Immigrants operates a post-release house for people who are released from immigration detention in northern Louisiana, where there has just been an explosion of private facilities there and private ICE facilities there. And we have this home where people can have a safe respite after they're released. In COVID, it's been a great place for people to quarantine before they are reunited with family, or before they, go on to the next leg of their journey. And at this facility, at this house, we have a map, and we ask people to place a pin on the map wherever they consider home. And a lot of people choose their country of origin, but a lot of people put where their sponsor is going to be, where they're going to be living, the person sponsoring them if they're an asylum seeker, or where their, family member lives. Maybe they haven't, been to that area before, but they know they're going to be living there because that's where their loved one is. And that really just sort of really helped me reframe the way I think about what home is to someone, and what home is to, both the asylum seekers that come through our immigration detention system, through the border, but also people who have been living in the, United States for years. The first time I ever went to an immigration detention center and visited with people who were detained there was actually my second week of work. And I kind of naively went into the facility, and I visited the Elizabeth Detention Center outside New York in Elizabeth, New Jersey, which is operated by CoreCivic. And I went in there thinking I was going to have to be speaking a lot of Spanish, that I was going to be meeting a lot of people from the border. And everyone I met there was primarily from the Caribbean. We're Haitian. I met a man from Antigua. And primarily from Africa, from Cameroon, from Kenya, and they all spoke English to me. I didn't have to speak Spanish at all. And the one man from Antigua that I spoke with actually ended up in detention. He'd lived in the United States since he was 3, and got pulled over for a faulty taillight when he was taking his kids to school. And he had, something on his criminal record, and that was reason enough for him to be pulled over and be transferred into ICE custody, where he was facing pending deportation charges. And, so I think it's important to think about the mix of people who are in immigration detention custody, whether that is asylum seekers who, were detained maybe upon arriving at JFK, were detained at the border, and also people who have been living in our communities for a long time. And I think it's important to view everyone in ICE detention as members of our community, because, something that we're trying to do is sort of build up the network of sponsors, people who have an extra room in their home who want to take someone in while their immigration cases go through the courts. And just sort of rethinking about what a world without detention would look like. And I think that's kind of going to be central to our mission in the Biden administration and going forward. But yeah, I just thought those anecdotes were helpful for me in reframing that thinking, and I think they would be helpful for your viewers as well.
And that's interesting. You talk about this idea of sort of sponsoring people.
in their credible fear interview with their attorney, that can be used against them if it gets published, and that can have an impact on their asylum proceedings. So that's something that, we really try, at least when I'm working with people who are directly impacted, really try to stress to them and say, like, they may push you on this specific detail, but if anything that you say can be used against you if you have an open asylum case and it's still being processed. And so I think there's just like a level of, I think it's important for reporters to realize that their stories really do have an impact and can have an impact, either good or bad. Media attention is good in a lot of cases, in that we've seen cases where, like, if we bring attention to a story of someone in detention, sometimes in a lot of ways that protects them, because the guards in the facility know that they're being watched and that person is reporting out what's happening. Or it can have the adverse effect that person gets retaliated, right? They can be moved to another facility farther away from their attorney, farther away from their family. They can be deported. We've seen that multiple times over the course of this year. People who went public with their stories of abuse have been deported. So I think it's important for reporters to realize that and keep that in mind when they're working with people who are directly impacted. I think for the general population, I really can't stress enough that, what we were talking about earlier about, the overlap of the immigration space, and just, I think there's a general lack of understanding as to what ICE detention actually is. I think people still, I think the whole kids in cages phrase has really sort of minimized. It's very, very, obviously what happened in family separation is atrocious, but it's just one abuse that happens on a daily basis in immigration detention. And I think, I will definitely recommend everyone read Felipe de la Hosa's story in The Baffler, where he talks about, talked about the specific issue. And I think, it's important for people to know just how expansive this detention system is, and how it just is, it really has, it goes just in so many levels and impacts our communities in so many ways. And yeah, I would just encourage people to really read up on that, to learn about, like, why abolition is so important, and find out ways to get involved locally, even if it's just like you find out that there is your local county jail contracts with ICE. Find out when that contract is up for renewal, and show up to these, like, county commission hearings and get involved, because it really does have an impact. And it isn't just facilities along the border. Like, these are jails in our own communities that are detaining people on behalf of ICE.
And so I will just ask, you mentioned abolition. Is Freedom for Immigrants an abolitionist organization?
We are, yes. Yeah.
And what does that mean? Can you explain that to our viewers? We're probably going to do a whole episode next year on police and prison abolition. But just for now, in the immigration context, what does it mean for Freedom for Immigrants to be an abolitionist organization?
Yeah, I think for us, it's, recognizing that immigration detention is part of a mass incarceration system, and standing with allied organizations, fighting for the abolition of all jails and prisons. And so, I think it's, for us, it's acknowledging the racist history of just incarceration in general, and a lot of the history that Jack talked about earlier. But also, in a modern day context, it's, ending ICE contracts on the local jail level, but also, ending private prison contracts as well, and just sort of, like, I keep going back to it, but just sort of building a world without cages. And we do have a tab on our website that's kind of goes into the history of U.S. incarceration and how that pivots into detaining immigrants. So it's like freedomforimmigrants.org/why abolition. But yeah, I think that's something that definitely drew me to this organization. And I think that's something that I think a lot of organizations should and are moving towards a space where they're coming to the realization that agencies like ICE and CBP are beyond the point of reform.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. I'm glad to see that we got our video back. Thank you to all of our viewers for sticking with us through those technical issues. And for asking some really great questions. As a reminder, if you're on HAPS, you can easily ask us questions. We will see them in real time and we will answer them. Also, if you're on HAPS and you enjoyed the show, I would highly encourage you to subscribe to the channel. And if you're feeling generous, I would appreciate it if you can sponsor the show for $5 a month, because this show, Sterne Look, is entirely viewer supported. We will be back next week. And we will also, probably not next week, but within a few weeks, do another episode actually on immigration reporting. There are a lot of good immigration journalists out there doing important work, including Philippe Delahoz, who Rebecca mentioned, who were unfortunately unable to make it tonight. Thank you to Jack and Max and Rebecca for being here. And to the viewers, be on the lookout for another immigration reporting episode soon. And as I said, we're going to be covering police and prison abolition, planning to cover public records reporting and FOIA, planning to talk to people who embed with the military and report on military issues. So stick with us. We have a lot of great content planned for the rest of December and the beginning of the new year.
Thank you.
All right.